First of all, let me say thank you to all who have already spoken and sung and prayed. Your words have stirred me, and thank you to all who have organized and brought about this gathering. I want to begin with a brief confession of faith, fitting to this moment. I believe in peace, and I've committed my life to the ways that make for peace. I believe that there can be no real peace with the existence of nuclear weapons. As a follower of Jesus, I must take seriously the command to love my enemies, and we cannot wage war or threaten nuclear annihilation against those we love. Nor can we promote the existence of weapons that kill billions and destroy the earth that gives us life. As a follower of Jesus, I must take seriously the command to love my neighbors. And we cannot pour resources into expanding nuclear arsenals at the expense of the impoverished in our community. With so many of our neighbors in need of homes, jobs, safety, decent education, and opportunity for their families, we cannot love our neighbors and also support warmongers and war profiteers at their expense. If you believe in peace, if you have committed your life to the ways that make for peace, then you know that there can be no real peace alongside the threat of nuclear weapons. And now a confession, a personal confession from some of the early years of my marriage. It was slightly post the honeymoon stage, and reality was setting in, and it turns out that my beloved had a great twisted desire to tease me and push my buttons. And he would do this rather frequently, and of course, the more it irked me, the more it inspired him. And so, to my horror, I frequently found that a very successful way of shutting him up was whacking him on the head. And when I would do that with great emotion to send a very clear, strong message. I don't want you to do this. And you might say that it was effective because he stopped, but only for 30 minutes. In fact, I would argue that it actually inspired him to continue escalating his teasing. My actions of violence, even in a playful way, did not stop the outcome that I wanted it to stop. And ultimately, it did not make me feel better because I walked around feeling guilty that I had in me this great passion that I couldn't control and it would explode. It didn't bring us closer together. It didn't bring us toward healing or a stronger relationship. In fact, it created a wedge between us. And I share this story, this silly example, to remind us that unless we can learn to live peacefully with our loved ones, which does take practice, and unless we can learn to live peacefully with our neighbors, which does take patience, and unless we can learn somehow to live peacefully with our enemies, which takes serious, prayerful intention, we cannot demand the same of others. Peace is not only our goal, it is our means to our goal. And the foundation of peace is justice. The force of peace is love. If we want peace at our goal, it must also be the means through which we get there. Let's apply the same logic to much larger concerns in humanity, especially in light of very real world tyrants with great power and propensity to destroy. Carl, you mentioned Ukraine, and it's important today to acknowledge what's happening in Ukraine. Ukraine is yet another manifestation of expanding empire that is seeking to destroy yet another people, yet another community and culture and land. And the news is filled with the horrors of war, its devastation, its death, mass graves, people fleeing their homes, bodies left in the streets. And it can be tempting, and indeed I've heard even from loved ones in my circles, Ukraine is the very reason why we must have nuclear weapons. We need them as a deterrent from the bullies. But glorification of war to keep our enemies at bay is not the answer. Peace is not just our goal, it must be our means. The threat of nuclear power will not solve the problems of this world. If we are committed to peace with justice, we must find humane ways to hold tyrants accountable, to hold warmongers accountable, ways to hold people accountable without destroying our own humanity, let alone our environment, our world in the process. I have a friend who used to be a diplomat to the Ukraine. She's currently a legal scholar there. And she's come and done presentations on the harsh realities that are on the ground. And it is tear-inducing and it is stomach churning. But as she talks with passion about the tireless hours that she has spent trying to get her friends to safety, she also shares the courage of the people who are currently on the ground in Ukraine. People who are currently living under siege, under constant bomb attacks, who are looking death in the face and continuing to believe in the ways of peace. She talks about her Ukrainian friends who are very clear that they long for liberation, but their liberation will not come until Russians too have been liberated. For a country that engaged in nuclear disarmament and is now under threat of weapons of mass destruction, the people she knows continue to hope for peace, to believe in peace, and to fight for peace. And she tells us that we who are far away must not have less hope for peace than the people who are living under bombs. We must follow their example. We must do our work, our hope, our commitment to be people who follow the ways of peace. I don't know many Ukrainians. Personally, I know Palestinians. And I carry with me a bracelet from the last time I was in Bethlehem. A bracelet that I purchased at the Aida refugee camp, which happens to be the place where the most tear gas canisters fall in the world. Tear gas canisters made in the United States, made from our tax dollars. And yet the Palestinians that I know, those who hope and work for peace, those who insist on nonviolence, take the tear gas canisters and mold them into something beautiful. And it is a sign of the hope that we must have. For let us not have less hope for peace than those living under occupation, settler colonial violence, strategic ethnic cleansing. As Palestinians demand their freedom, their justice, their equality through non-violent means, may we follow their commitments. to demand peace, and to work for justice. Today is a significant day. April 15th in the United States is synonymous with tax day. And I know my sister's a CPA and she insists that today isn't tax day. It's going to be Monday. But still, it is April 15th. April 15th, tax day, calls us to ask the question, where are we putting our money, our resources, and our attention? In 2018, nearly $20 billion of our taxes were used to fund nuclear weapons. And I believe 813 billion is what's currently being invested in nuclear arsenals. What does Jesus have to say to this? Well, famously, Jesus said, give to Caesar what is Caesar and give to God what is God's. But what Jesus was really saying is that the ways of empire, the ways of Caesar are not the ways of God. And we are to be following in the ways of God, not the ways of empire. Jesus was clear that there are bigger powers at play in the world than those of empire. And we are invited, we are beseeched to pour our true treasures in the way of peace and love and justice. And so we gather. We gather to say we can't fully control what happens to our tax dollars, but we can insist that it's wrong, and we can insist that we will give to God the deepest treasures that we have, and we will follow the ways of peace and justice and love as best we are able. Today is also Passover, the Jewish celebration of Pesach, which celebrates the freedom and liberation of oppressed people. To worship a God of freedom and a liberation is to work to bring about freedom to the oppressed and liberation to those who are enslaved. And those who are enslaved in their poverty long for and need freedom, and those enslaved to their riches may not long for it, but desperately need freedom. Today is also Good Friday. Good Friday, when Jesus was again clear that the ways of empire yield death, a death that he himself was subject to. But he was also clear that the ways of community yield life. We acknowledge today that innocent people continue to suffer and die at the hands of the sins of the world. And we are called to identify with those who suffer and work to end their mistreatment. And today that brings us here to Lawrence Livermore Nuclear Labs. I want to end my remarks by offering the prophetic words of Archbishop John Wester of Santa Fe, New Mexico. Many of you saw and have read his pastoral letter, and his words urging, demanding conversations toward nuclear disarmament are so profound that Friday. And so indulge me as I read a few paragraphs of words that so desperately need to be heard in this place, throughout our country, and throughout the world. Archbishop Wester says, we can no longer deny or ignore the dangerous predicament that we have created for ourselves. We need to start talking about it with one another, all of us, and figure out concrete steps toward abolishing nuclear weapons and ending nuclear threat. If we care about humanity, if we care about our planet, if we care about, then we must start a public conversation on the urgent questions and find a new path toward nuclear disarmament. Convinced as I am, this is Archbishop Wester, convinced that I am that a world without nuclear weapons is possible and necessary. I ask political leaders not to forget that these weapons cannot protect us from current threats to national and international security. We need to ponder the catastrophic impact of their deployment, especially from a humanitarian and environmental standpoint, and reject heightening climates of fear, mistrust, and hostility, to commit ourselves globally to the complete abolition of nuclear weapons. We should end all these massive financial investments for building and maintaining these weapons of mass destruction, investments that make only a few individuals and corporations massive funds in education, healthcare, environmental cleanup, addressing the climate threat, rebuilding our infrastructure, and providing vaccines for everyone, everywhere, against future pandemics. This tax day, what does the Lord require of us? Let me just share a few ideas for action, adapted again from Archbishop Wester, and I hope they'll be shared in the chat as well, so you can follow up, join the dialogue. Talk about the presence of nuclear weapons in our community, with our family, with our friends, with our coworkers, with our congregation, with our book groups, with our exercise groups, with whoever you come in contact with. I invite you to read the power and share his letter to start a conversation on how we can work together for the abolition of nuclear weapons. I invite you to pray daily for the abolition of nuclear weapons and practice nonviolence in our own lives, with our loved ones, with our neighbors, with our enemies. I encourage you to express your support for the Treaty of the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, especially with your political representatives. And finally, if you have investments, please use your money consciously. There's a link in the chat so that you can look up how to not invest in nuclear weapons. We must divest. We must abolish. These final words also come from Archbishop Wester, and I'll close with these. As we engage in conversations, he encourages us, all our conversations should be respectful, rooted in prayer, based in nonviolence, and centered in the hope and belief that nuclear disarmament is achievable. We can do this. And with the God of peace with us, we can do this soon. Amen.
Amen.